The desert wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood across the small Afghan village. Lieutenant Sarah Chen crouched behind a crumbling mud wall. Her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. The firefight had been going on for 20 minutes, and she could hear the wounded calling for help. "Medic! We need a medic over here." The voice belonged to Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the Navy SEALs she had been assigned to support. Sarah had been with this unit for 3 months, but she still felt like an outsider. The SEALs were a tight group, and they didn't easily trust anyone who wasn't one of them. Sarah took a deep breath and sprinted across the open courtyard. Bullets whistled past her head, but she kept running. She had trained for this moment her entire career. Born in San Francisco to immigrant parents, she had always felt the need to prove herself. Her father worked in a restaurant kitchen, and her mother cleaned office buildings at night. They had sacrificed everything so Sarah could go to medical school. When she reached Rodriguez, she saw the problem immediately. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg, and blood was soaking into the dusty ground. But Rodriguez wasn't the only one hurt. 3 other SEALs were down, and the enemy fire was getting heavier. "Doc, we're pinned down," Rodriguez gasped through gritted teeth. "Can't move these guys without getting shot to pieces." Sarah looked around the area. They were trapped in a small alley between 2 buildings. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides. She could see muzzle flashes from the windows above them. The situation was bad, and it was getting worse. She started working on Rodriguez's wound, but her mind was racing. These men had families back home. Sergeant Martinez had shown her pictures of his twin daughters just that morning. Petty Officer Johnson was getting married in 6 months. They trusted her to keep them alive. But she was just one person with a medical bag. "How many hostiles do you count?" she asked Rodriguez while she bandaged his leg. "Too many," he replied. "Command says backup is 30 minutes out. We don't have 30 minutes. Sarah finished with Rodriguez and moved to the next wounded SEAL. This one was worse. Petty Officer Williams had taken a bullet to the chest. His breathing was shallow, and his lips were turning blue. She needed to get him to a proper medical facility immediately, or he would die. The other wounded SEALs were Corpsman Hayes, who had a head injury, and Staff Sergeant Brown, who had been hit in the shoulder. All 4 men needed immediate evacuation, but the enemy fire made that impossible. "Doc, what's your assessment?" asked Lieutenant Commander Thompson, the unit leader. He had crawled over to check on his men. "Williams needs surgery in the next hour, or we're going to lose him," Sarah replied honestly. "The others are stable for now, but we need to get them out of here." Thompson nodded grimly. He was a veteran of many operations, and he knew when a situation was hopeless. "The extract point is 200 meters north of here. Might as well be 200 miles with this much enemy fire." "Friend," Sarah continued treating the wounded, but she could see the doubt in Thompson's eyes. He was calculating odds, and those odds weren't good. The enemy had superior numbers and position. The SEALs who weren't wounded were running low on ammunition. As she worked, Sarah thought about the village they were in. Intelligence had reported that a high-value target was hiding here. The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, capture the target, get out. But the intelligence was wrong. Instead of finding one terrorist leader, they had walked into a trap with dozens of enemy fighters. The wounded SEALs were depending on her, but Sarah felt helpless. All her medical training meant nothing if she couldn't get these men to safety. She had learned to treat gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, but she had never learned how to make enemy bullets stop flying. Williams was getting weaker. His pulse was fast and weak, and his skin was pale and clammy. He was going into shock from blood loss. Sarah had done everything she could with the supplies she had, but it wasn't enough. He needed blood, surgery, and intensive care. "Doc," Williams whispered, grabbing her hand. "Tell my wife I love her." "You're going to tell her yourself," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm not letting you die here." But even as she said the words, she wondered if she was making a promise she couldn't keep. The enemy fire was getting more accurate. Bullets were hitting closer and closer to their position. Soon, the enemy fighters would advance, and there would be nowhere left to hide. Rodriguez tried to sit up, Doc, you need to get out of here. When they overrun our position, you run. You hear me? Sarah shook her head. I'm not leaving anyone behind. That's not a request, Doc. It's an order. Sarah looked around at the wounded men. These brave soldiers were telling her to abandon them to save herself. But that went against everything she believed in. She had taken an oath to do no harm, to preserve life. How could she run away when people needed her help? The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Sarah could hear the enemy fighters shouting to each other as they moved in for the final assault. Thompson was on the radio, calling for immediate air support, but she could tell from his voice that help wouldn't arrive in time. Williams grabbed her arm again. His eyes were unfocused, but he was trying to say something. Sarah leaned closer to hear him. "The woman," he whispered. "The woman in the house. She helped me." Sarah looked confused. What woman? What house? But Williams had lost consciousness. His words didn't make sense, but there was something urgent in the way he had said them. Sarah looked around the alley, trying to understand what he meant. That's when she noticed it. In all the chaos and confusion, she had missed something important. One of the buildings facing them had a different kind of damage. While most of the walls showed fresh bullet holes from the current firefight, this building had older damage, burn marks around the windows, scorch marks on the walls, and in one of the upper windows, she saw a flash of movement. Not the muzzle flash of an enemy weapon, but something else. Someone was in that building, and they weren't shooting at the SEALs. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of staying behind cover, she stood up and walked into the middle of the alley. The other SEALs shouted at her to get down, but she ignored them. She looked up at the window where she had seen the movement. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The gunfire continued around her, but Sarah felt strangely calm. Then she saw her. A woman, probably in her 30s, looking down from the damaged window. The woman's eyes met Sarah's, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, a connection that transcended language and culture and the violence happening around them. The woman disappeared from the window. A minute later, Sarah heard a door creak open behind her. She turned around and saw the same woman standing in a doorway, gesturing frantically for them to come inside. "She's offering us shelter," Sarah called to Thompson. Thompson shook his head. "Could be a trap, Doc." Sarah looked back at the woman. There was something in her eyes, something that reminded Sarah of her own mother. The same fierce determination to protect the people she cared about. Sarah had seen that look before, when her mother worked 3 jobs to pay for Sarah's education. "She's not the enemy," Sarah said with certainty she couldn't explain. The woman spoke quickly in a language Sarah didn't understand, but her gestures were clear. She was pointing to the wounded SEALs and then to her house. She wanted to help them. Williams was barely breathing. Hayes was drifting in and out of consciousness. Brown and Rodriguez were losing blood despite Sarah's efforts to stop it. They were running out of time and options. Sarah made another decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She picked up her medical bag and started walking toward the woman's house. The other SEALs called after her, but she didn't stop. The woman led her through a doorway into a small, dark room. The house was old but clean. Sarah could see that it had been hit by explosions before, but someone had worked hard to repair the damage. "Bring them," Sarah called back to Thompson. "She's going to help us." Thompson hesitated for a moment, then started organizing his men to move the wounded. They had no other choice. The enemy was closing in, and they needed shelter. One by one, they carried the wounded SEALs into the house. The woman helped them, showing no fear even as bullets flew past the doorway. She seemed to know exactly what to do, as if she had done this before. Once all the wounded were inside, the woman barred the door and led them deeper into the house. She brought them to a back room that was larger than the others. There were clean blankets on the floor and medical supplies on a wooden table. Sarah stared at the supplies in amazement. There were bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, and even some surgical instruments. This wasn't just a civilian house. This was some kind of medical facility. The woman spoke to Sarah again, pointing to Williams and then to the medical supplies. She was telling Sarah to use whatever she needed. As Sarah worked to stabilize Williams with the better supplies, she wondered about this mysterious woman. Who was she? How did she have medical equipment? Why was she risking her life to help American soldiers? The woman seemed to understand Sarah's confusion. She pointed to herself and said a single word in English. Doctor. Sarah's hands froze for a moment. This woman was a doctor too. That explained the medical supplies and her calm demeanor in a crisis situation. But it raised even more questions. The woman, seeing Sarah's surprise, smiled sadly and spoke a few more words in broken English. My hospital. Destroyed. Sarah looked around the room with new understanding. This woman had once run a hospital or clinic in this village. When it was destroyed, she had set up this secret medical station in her home. She had been treating injured people, probably from both sides of the conflict. Williams stirred slightly, and his breathing improved with the better medical care. The woman helped Sarah treat the other wounded SEALs, working with skill and efficiency that impressed even Sarah. As they worked together, Sarah realized that she had found something unexpected in this war zone. She had found a kindred spirit. Another doctor who was willing to risk everything to save lives. But the enemy fighters were still outside, still looking for them. The house provided temporary shelter, but it wouldn't protect them forever. Soon, the enemy would search every building in the village. Sarah looked at the woman who had saved them. She still didn't know her name, but she knew that this woman was about to risk her life again. If the enemy found American soldiers in her house, they would kill her without hesitation. The woman seemed to understand the danger too. But when Sarah pointed toward the door, suggesting that they should leave to protect her, the woman shook her head firmly. She pointed to Williams and the other wounded men. Her message was clear. These men needed more time to stabilize before they could be moved. She was willing to face any danger to make sure they survived. Sarah felt a deep respect for this woman. In the middle of a war zone, surrounded by violence and hatred, she had found someone who shared her commitment to healing and saving lives. But she also felt a growing fear. The enemy voices outside were getting louder. Time was running out for all of them. The woman moved with purpose around the hidden medical room. Sarah watched her prepare what looked like surgical instruments, her movements precise and confident. Outside, the sounds of the enemy searching house by house grew closer. "What's your name?" Sarah whispered in English. The woman looked up from her preparations and touched her chest. "Amira," she said softly. "Sarah," Sarah replied, pointing to herself. Amira nodded and continued her work. She had pulled out a small kerosene lamp to provide better light. In the glow, Sarah could see the woman's face more clearly. There were stress lines around her eyes, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked with medical instruments for years. Williams was breathing better, but he wasn't out of danger. Amira examined his wound and spoke to Sarah in a mix of broken English and gestures. She was suggesting a procedure that could help, but it was risky without proper equipment. "Too dangerous," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. Amira pointed to Williams and then made a cutting motion across her throat. She was telling Sarah that without the procedure, Williams would die anyway. Before Sarah could respond, they heard voices right outside the house. The enemy fighters had reached their street. Thompson held up his hand, signaling everyone to stay completely quiet. The SEALs who could still fight had positioned themselves near the windows and doorways. They had limited ammunition left, but they were ready to defend the house if necessary. Rodriguez, despite his wounded leg, had managed to position himself where he could cover the main entrance. Amira surprised everyone by crawling to a corner of the room and pulling up what looked like a loose floorboard. Underneath was a hidden space with more medical supplies and something else. A radio. She turned on the radio very quietly and began listening to different frequencies. Sarah realized that Amira had been monitoring communications, probably trying to help injured people throughout the area. After a few minutes of listening, Amira's face changed. She had heard something important. She crawled over to Thompson and whispered urgently in broken English. American. Helicopter. Coming. But wrong place. Thompson looked confused. What do you mean wrong place? Amira pointed north and shook her head. Then she pointed east and nodded. She was telling them that the rescue helicopter was heading to the wrong location. Thompson got on his radio, trying to contact the incoming aircraft. But he couldn't get through. The mountains were blocking the signal, or the enemy was jamming communications. Amira listened to her radio again. This time she looked even more worried. She spoke rapidly in her native language, then tried to explain in English. Many bad men. Coming here. Looking for Americans. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Not only were local enemy fighters searching for them, but reinforcements were coming. They would be completely outnumbered. Williams stirred and tried to speak. Sarah leaned closer to hear him. The extraction point, he whispered weakly. It's compromised. Enemy knew we were coming. Sarah looked at Thompson, who had heard Williams too. The lieutenant commander's face was grim. If Williams was right, then this whole mission had been based on bad intelligence. The enemy had known they were coming and had prepared accordingly. Amira had been listening to their conversation. She spoke to Sarah again, gesturing toward Williams. He told me. Before, Amira said in careful English. When I find him, he was hurt. He'd tell me about Trap. Sarah was confused. You found him before? When? Amira pointed to a corner of the room where there were bloodstains on the floor. Yesterday. He come here. Very hurt. I help him. Thompson stared at Williams in surprise. You were here yesterday? How is that possible? Williams tried to sit up. I was on reconnaissance. Got separated from my unit. Wounded. She saved my life. Got former 70C. I got a crash dot. Sarah was starting to understand. Williams had been injured during an earlier mission and had somehow found his way to Amira's house. She had treated him and hidden him from the enemy. Why didn't you report this when you returned to base? Thompson asked. Williams looked uncomfortable. I couldn't remember exactly where I was. I was pretty badly hurt. I just remembered a woman helping me. Amira spoke again, more urgently this time. Yesterday. I hear radio. Bad men talk about Trap for Americans. They know you coming. Thompson processed this information quickly. The mission had been compromised from the beginning. The enemy had known about their operation and had set up an ambush. But how had they gotten that information? Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps on the roof above them. The enemy fighters were searching the house. Everyone in the room held their breath. Amira quickly covered the wounded SEALs with blankets and gestured for everyone to lie flat. She blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into darkness. They could hear voices directly above them. The enemy fighters were in the upper part of the house, searching for any sign of the American soldiers. Sarah could feel her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. One of the enemy fighters said something loudly, and there was the sound of furniture being moved around. They were conducting a thorough search. Amira crawled to Sarah's side and whispered so quietly that Sarah could barely hear her. They look for you, but they also look for me. You? Sarah whispered back. They know I help people. They want to stop me. Sarah realized that Amira wasn't just risking her life to help American soldiers. She had been helping injured people in the village for months, probably treating anyone who needed medical care, regardless of which side they were on. This made her a target for extremists who didn't want anyone showing mercy to their enemies. The searching continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, the voices moved away from their part of the house. They could hear the enemy fighters leaving through the front door, but Amira held up her hand, signaling them to wait. She was right to be cautious. A few minutes later, they heard different footsteps. Someone else was in the house. This time the steps were lighter, more careful. Amira listened intently, then relaxed slightly. She whispered a single word that Sarah didn't understand. A young voice answered from somewhere in the house. Amira whispered back, and there was a brief conversation in the local language. Amira turned to the group and explained in English. My nephew. He watched for bad men. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old appeared in the doorway. He spoke rapidly to Amira in their language. Amira's face grew serious as she listened to the boy. She turned to Thompson and Sarah. Many bad men coming, she said. Too many. They search every house again. Soon they find us. Thompson checked his ammunition. His men did the same. They were running very low on bullets and had no chance against a large enemy force. How long until they get here? Thompson asked. Amira spoke to the boy again. He held up his hand, showing 5 fingers. 5 minutes, Amira translated. Williams tried to sit up again. Despite his weakness, he was thinking clearly. There has to be another way out of here. Amira nodded and pointed toward the back of the room. Sarah hadn't noticed it before, but there was a small opening in the back wall, partially hidden by hanging cloth. Tunnel, Amira explained, goes to Old Well, outside village. Thompson examined the opening. It was small, just big enough for one person at a time to crawl through. But it might be their only chance. Can we move the wounded through there? Sarah asked. Amira looked at Williams and the other injured SEALs. She spoke to her nephew again, and the boy nodded. He help, Amira said. He know tunnel very good. Sarah looked at her patients. Williams was stable but weak. Rodriguez could probably crawl with help. Hayes was conscious but had a head injury that made him confused. Brown's shoulder wound would make crawling difficult but not impossible. We'll have to carry Williams, Sarah told Thompson. Thompson nodded. Rodriguez, can you make it through that tunnel? I'll make it, Rodriguez replied grimly. Amira began gathering her medical supplies. She handed Sarah a bag containing antibiotics and pain medication. For them, she said, pointing to the wounded SEALs. What about you? Sarah asked. You have to come with us. Amira shook her head. I cannot leave. Why not? They'll kill you if they find out you helped us. Amira pointed around the room. This is my hospital. People need me here. I cannot abandon them. Sarah understood, but she also felt frustrated. This brave woman had risked everything to save American soldiers, and now she was refusing to save herself. You've done enough, Sarah told her. You don't owe anyone anything more. Amira smiled sadly. My husband was doctor. He killed by bomb 3 years ago. Before he die, he make me promise. Keep helping people, no matter what. Sarah felt a deep sadness for this woman, who had lost so much but continued to dedicate her life to healing others. She wanted to convince Amira to escape with them, but she could see the determination in her eyes. The boy spoke urgently to Amira. The enemy fighters were getting closer. Thompson organized his men for the escape. The 2 SEALs who could still fight would go first to secure the tunnel exit. Then the wounded would be helped through one at a time. Sarah would go last to make sure everyone made it safely. They began the escape immediately. Hayes went first, with help from the boy who guided him through the tunnel. Brown followed, moving slowly because of his shoulder wound. Williams was the most difficult to move. He was too weak to crawl on his own, so Thompson and Rodriguez had to push him through the tunnel, while Sarah followed behind, monitoring his condition. As they made their way through the narrow tunnel, Sarah could hear voices back at the house. The enemy fighters had returned and were conducting an even more thorough search. The tunnel was longer than Sarah had expected. They crawled for several minutes through the dark, cramped space. The air was stale and hot, and Williams was having trouble breathing. Finally, they saw light ahead. The tunnel opened into an old stone well outside the village. One by one, they climbed out into the night air. All the SEALs had made it safely through the tunnel. Williams was unconscious but still breathing. The others were tired and in pain, but they were alive. Thompson immediately got on his radio to call for extraction. This time, he was able to reach the rescue helicopter and guide them to the correct location. But Sarah kept looking back toward the village. She was thinking about Amira, alone in her house, facing the enemy fighters who would soon discover evidence that Americans had been there. We have to go back for her, Sarah told Thompson. Thompson shook his head. "Doc," she made her choice. "Our priority is getting the wounded to safety." Sarah knew he was right, but it felt wrong to abandon someone who had saved their lives. As they waited for the helicopter, she made a decision that would surprise everyone. The helicopter's rotors were getting louder as it approached their position. Sarah could see the aircraft's lights cutting through the darkness. In a few minutes, they would all be safe, flying back to base where Williams and the others could get proper medical treatment. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Amira. She kept looking back toward the village, where she could see flashlights moving between the buildings. The enemy fighters were still searching, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the tunnel and realized how the Americans had escaped. Thompson was coordinating with the helicopter pilot over the radio. The aircraft was 2 minutes out. Sarah made her choice. "I'm going back," she announced. Standing up and checking her medical bag, Thompson grabbed her arm. "Doc, that's suicide. You'll never make it back to her house. And even if you did, you couldn't get her out." "I have to try," Sarah replied. "She saved our lives. I can't just leave her." Rodriguez, despite his wounded leg, struggled to his feet. "If Doc's going back, I'm going with her." "Nobody's going anywhere," Thompson said firmly. "That's an order." Sarah looked at the wounded SEALs lying on the ground. Williams was barely conscious, but he was looking at her. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Sarah knelt beside him. "What is it?" she asked. Williams grabbed her hand weakly. With great effort, he whispered, She has a daughter." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What?" "Her daughter, hidden in the village somewhere. Amira told me yesterday." Thompson heard this too. His expression changed. If Amira had a daughter, then she wasn't just risking her own life by staying behind. She was trying to protect her child. The helicopter was now visible in the distance, its spotlight sweeping the ground as it searched for their exact location. They had less than a minute before it landed. Sarah stood up. "I'm not getting on that helicopter without her." Thompson looked torn. He had orders to extract his team and get the wounded to medical care. But he also understood why Sarah couldn't abandon someone who had saved their lives. William spoke again, so quietly that Sarah had to put her ear close to his mouth to hear him. "The boy, her nephew. He knows where the daughter is hidden." Sarah realized that the young boy who had helped them escape might still be in the village. If she could find him, he could lead her to Amira's daughter. Then maybe she could convince Amira to escape with them. The helicopter touched down 50 meters away. The pilot and crew chief jumped out, ready to load the wounded SEALs. Thompson ran over to brief them on the situation. Sarah watched the medical crew efficiently prepare Williams for transport. In a few minutes, he would be on an operating table at a field hospital. The other wounded SEALs would also get the treatment they needed, but she couldn't shake the image of Amira, alone in her house, waiting for enemy fighters to discover what she had done. The woman had risked everything to save American soldiers. She deserved better than to be abandoned. Thompson came back from the helicopter. "Doc, the pilot says they can wait 5 more minutes, but that's it. After that, they have to leave whether we're on board or not." Sarah made up her mind. She pulled out her sidearm and checked that it was loaded. She had never fired a weapon in combat before, but she knew how to use it. "Give me Rodriguez's night vision goggles," she said. Thompson started to protest, but Rodriguez was already taking off his equipment. "She's right, LT. We can't leave that woman behind." Sarah took the goggles and started walking back toward the village. Thompson called after her, but she didn't stop. She had made her decision, and nothing was going to change her mind. The village was about 300 meters away. Sarah moved carefully, using every bit of cover she could find. The enemy fighters had flashlights, but they weren't using night vision, which gave her an advantage. As she got closer to the houses, she could hear voices and see lights moving around. The search was intensifying. She counted at least 8 different light sources, which meant there were probably more enemy fighters than that. Sarah reached the edge of the village and started working her way toward Amira's house. She had to move very slowly to avoid being seen. Every shadow could be hiding an enemy fighter. She was halfway to the house when she heard shouting from the direction she had come from. The enemy had found the old well and the tunnel entrance. They knew exactly how the Americans had escaped. Sarah heard heavy footsteps running toward Amira's house. She had to get there first and warn her. She abandoned stealth and ran through the narrow alleyways. Behind her, she could hear the enemy fighters spreading out to search the entire area around the tunnel entrance. When she reached Amira's house, Sarah found the front door slightly open. She crept inside, her weapon ready. The house was dark and seemed empty, but she could hear quiet voices coming from the back room. Sarah made her way through the house, trying not to make any noise. When she reached the medical room, she saw Amira kneeling next to a small pile of supplies, burning papers in a metal bowl. Amira looked up when Sarah entered. Her eyes widened with surprise and fear. "Why you come back?" Amira whispered urgently. "To get you out of here," Sarah replied. "They found the tunnel. They know you helped us." Amira shook her head. "Too late. They coming now." As if to prove her point, they heard voices outside the house. The enemy fighters had arrived. "Where's your daughter?" Sarah asked quietly. Amira's face showed shock. "How you know about her?" "Williams told me." "Where is she?" Amira pointed toward the floor. Sarah realized there must be another hidden space, like the tunnel entrance. "She hiding," Amira explained. "Safe place. But if I leave, she alone." Sarah understood the impossible choice Amira was facing. She could escape and abandon her daughter, or stay and face certain death when the enemy fighters discovered what she had done. The voices outside were getting closer. Sarah estimated they had maybe 2 minutes before the house would be searched again. "Show me where she is," Sarah said. Amira hesitated, then pulled up another loose floorboard. Underneath was a small space, just big enough for a child. A girl who looked about 8 years old was huddled inside, wide-eyed with fear. Sarah's heart broke seeing the terrified child. She understood now why Amira couldn't leave. But she also knew that staying meant death for both mother and daughter. "Listen to me," Sarah said urgently. "My helicopter is still here. We can get all 3 of us out. But we have to move right now." Amira looked torn. She wanted to believe it was possible, but she had seen too much violence and death to trust easily. The front door of the house slammed open. Heavy footsteps began moving through the rooms. The enemy fighters were inside. Sarah helped Amira lift her daughter out of the hiding place. The little girl clung to her mother, too frightened to make a sound. They could hear the fighters searching the front rooms. In a few seconds, they would reach the back of the house. Sarah looked around desperately. The tunnel entrance was in the corner, but it would take time to get through, and the enemy would hear them. The window was too high and too small. Then she noticed something she had missed before. Behind a hanging blanket was a door she hadn't seen earlier. Amira saw her looking at it and nodded. "Back way," Amira whispered. "To neighbor house." They moved as quietly as possible toward the hidden door. Sarah went first, her weapon ready. The door opened into a small courtyard behind the house. But as they stepped outside, they came face to face with an enemy fighter who had been positioned to watch the back entrance. For a moment, everyone froze. The fighter started to raise his weapon, but Sarah was faster. Her military training took over, and she fired 2 quick shots. The man dropped to the ground. The gunshots would alert every enemy fighter in the area. They had seconds before they would be surrounded. "Run," Sarah told Amira, pointing toward the village edge. They sprinted across the courtyard and into the next alley. Behind them, they could hear shouts as the other fighters discovered their fallen comrade. Sarah led them through the maze of narrow streets, trying to remember the way back to the helicopter. Amira carried her daughter, who remained silent despite the chaos around them. They were almost to the edge of the village when they ran into another group of enemy fighters. This time there were 3 of them, and they were ready for a fight. Sarah pushed Amira and her daughter behind a low wall and prepared for a gunfight she probably couldn't win. She had limited ammunition and was outnumbered 3-1. But before she could fire, there was a burst of automatic weapons fire from a different direction. The 3 enemy fighters dropped to the ground. Rodriguez appeared from behind a building, limping heavily but carrying an assault rifle. "Thought you might need backup, Doc," he said with a grin. Sarah was amazed that he had come back for them despite his wounded leg. "How did you get here so fast?" "Took a shortcut," Rodriguez replied. "Thompson's holding the helicopter. But we need to move now." They helped Amira and her daughter to their feet and started running toward the extraction point. Rodriguez covered their retreat, firing at any enemy fighters who tried to follow them. The helicopter was still on the ground when they reached it, rotors spinning. Thompson and the crew were waiting for them, providing covering fire as they approached. Sarah helped Amira and her daughter climb into the aircraft. The little girl was crying now, overwhelmed by the noise and confusion. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at the village below. She could see flashlights moving around as the enemy fighters continued their search. But they were too late. Everyone had escaped. Amira held her daughter close and looked at Sarah with tears in her eyes. Sarah squeezed her hand. "Thank you for saving my friends." During the flight back to base, Sarah learned more about Amira's story. Through a translator at the field hospital, she discovered that Amira had been one of the few female doctors in the region before the war intensified. When her hospital was destroyed, she had continued practicing medicine from her home, treating anyone who needed help. Her husband had been killed when their clinic was bombed 3 years earlier. Since then, she had been raising her daughter alone while continuing to provide medical care to her community. The young boy who had helped them was indeed her nephew. His parents had been killed in the same attack that destroyed the hospital. Amira had been caring for him as well. Williams survived his surgery and made a full recovery. Before he was evacuated to a larger medical facility, he asked to speak with Sarah. "That woman saved my life twice," he told her. "Once yesterday when I was bleeding to death, and again today when you went back for her." Sarah realized that Williams was right. Amira hadn't just saved them once. She had saved Williams the day before, treated him, and sent him back to his unit without asking for anything in return. When he came back wounded again, she had helped him a second time. "What's going to happen to her now?" Williams asked. Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Amira couldn't return to her village. The enemy fighters knew she had helped American soldiers, and they would kill her if they found her. But Sarah had an idea. She spoke to Thompson about it, and he agreed to help. 2 weeks later, Sarah was surprised to receive orders reassigning her to a new medical facility that was being established in a safer part of the country. When she arrived at her new post, she found Amira and her daughter waiting for her. The military had arranged for Amira to work as a translator and medical assistant at the new facility. Her daughter would be able to attend school there, and both of them would be safe from retaliation. "I thought you might want to work together again," Thompson told Sarah. "You two make a good team." Sarah was delighted. She had found not just a colleague, but a friend who shared her dedication to healing and saving lives. Over the following months, Sarah and Amira worked side by side, treating wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Amira's knowledge of local customs and languages made her invaluable, while Sarah's advanced medical training helped them save lives that might otherwise have been lost. The little girl, whose name was Layla, quickly learned English and became a favorite among the medical staff. She often helped by translating for patients who spoke only the local language. Amira's nephew was also brought to the safe facility, where he could live with his aunt and cousin while attending school. One day, while they were treating a particularly difficult case together, Amira spoke to Sarah in English that had improved dramatically over the months. "You know," Amira said, "when I first saw you in that alley, I thought you were just another soldier. But when you looked at me, I saw something different." "What did you see?" Sarah asked. "I saw another doctor. Someone who understood what it means to put other people's lives before your own." "Other SIDS," Sarah smiled. "I saw the same thing in you." They continued working in silence for a while. Then Amira spoke again. "My husband used to say that the best doctors are not the ones who know the most about medicine. They are the ones who care the most about people." Sarah thought about this as she worked. She had started her military career wanting to prove herself and serve her country. But through her experience with Amira, she had learned something more important. She had learned that healing wasn't just about medical knowledge or technical skills. It was about having the courage to help people, even when it was dangerous. It was about seeing beyond differences in language, culture, and nationality to recognize the shared humanity in everyone. Several months later, Sarah received news that Williams was being awarded a medal for his service. Rodriguez had also been honored for his bravery in returning to help with the rescue. But the person Sarah thought deserved the most recognition was Amira, who had risked everything to help strangers simply because they needed medical care. When Sarah suggested that Amira should be honored for her actions, her friend just smiled. "The reward is knowing that we helped people," Amira said. "That is enough for me." Sarah realized that this was the difference between a good doctor and a great one. Great doctors didn't need recognition or awards. They were motivated by something deeper: the simple desire to heal and help others. As time passed, the war eventually ended. Sarah was offered opportunities to return to civilian practice in the United States, but she chose to stay and continue working with Amira. Together, they established a permanent medical clinic that served both military personnel and local civilians. The clinic became known throughout the region as a place where anyone could receive medical care, regardless of their background or ability to pay. Layla grew up helping in the clinic and eventually decided to study medicine herself. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of her mother and Sarah, the woman who had risked her life to save them both. Years later, when journalists asked Sarah about her most important accomplishment during the war, she didn't talk about the soldiers she had saved or the medals she had received. Instead, she talked about a woman named Amira, who had taught her that true courage wasn't about fighting enemies or carrying weapons. True courage was about choosing to help people, even when it was dangerous, simply because it was the right thing to do. Sarah learned that sometimes the most important battles are not won with guns and explosives. They are won with compassion, dedication, and the simple decision to treat every human being as someone worth saving. The story of what happened in that village spread throughout the military medical community. It became an example of how medical professionals should approach their work, with skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to preserving life. But for Sarah, the most important lesson was personal. She had learned that being a doctor wasn't just about having medical knowledge. It was about having the wisdom to recognize that healing requires not just technical skill, but also empathy, bravery, and the willingness to see every patient as a human being deserving of care and respect. In the end, Sarah realized that Amira had taught her as much about being a doctor as medical school had. Perhaps more, because Amira had shown her that medicine at its best was not just about treating diseases and injuries. It was about affirming the value of human life and the bonds that connect all people, regardless of the differences that might seem to divide them.